So, did you guys know that it's actually illegal to own a katana in Japan without the proper paperwork? It's kind of like owning a gun in the US, right? And it's notoriously hard to get any paperwork for any weapon in Japan. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? But the Japanese kind of have one over us in the fact that JDM cars, if you're a car enthusiast, you'll know this, that you can't buy the latest Skyline R34, the 2002 model, the R34 V-Spec NER. You can't get it over here. It's actually illegal to own one of those Skylines here, or at least it's illegal to drive it on a public road. Now, also, too, funnily enough, one of the most rare cars in the world and richest cars in the world and fastest cars in the world, the Koenigsegg Agera, is also still illegal in the US to drive on the road. But the point of that is that we even have our own class restrictions here in IRL. Who would have thought? But I think that Riot has an impossible task when it comes to balancing their game. You think about it. I think Riot at this moment in time has 158 champions in the entire game. That also means that they have roughly around, right, because some spells are double, but that means there are 632 unique spells in the game as far as just champion abilities. And then there's something like, I don't know, I was looking on Reddit and it's like 10 to the power of 20 combinations of team compositions in a game of, 10 people. So you're counting both sides. So and I guess also too, it is actually theoretically impossible that all those combinations have actually been played out on Summoner's Rift. I don't know if that's true though, because there's a lot of fucking people that have played this game, right? But then again, you have to think with so many different champions that are getting released and how slow the progression of the game is, being played by less and less people, whatever. But the point is that it's going to get exponentially crazier as far as when Riot releases new champions. And that's not even just talking about the items that they release. So, and Riot usually creates more items than they remove, in fact. And usually they don't remove items, they just rework them, right? So, and I don't think they've actually ever removed a champion. I didn't play in beta, so I'm not sure if that statement is actually accurate, but I don't think they actually have removed a champion. So, at this rate, I think it's impossible for Riot to continue to balance their game at a comfortable pace, or the usual pace that they have been balancing the game. That is one patch every 2 weeks. And this is also probably why they ended up slowing down the rate of champion releases too. Because back in the day, we're talking like Season 1, Season 2, they used to release champions, I want to say, every patch, which is insane because it produced a ton of volatility in the game. And then they never really patched the champions that well either. And then they were releasing new items all the time, or like just reworking items. So there was just a whole bunch of broken shit in the entire game. And it was kind of frustrating, right? But I won't get into that because I've said that before. So the way to avoid this, the clear, obvious way is to do champion classes or just item classes, right? And if you at least restrict the items, you can kind of know which champions are going to be using those items. Now that means you have to create a whole class system, and you have to then put a champion in a class, which then restricts them and what they can buy and maybe what they can do on the map. But that's kind of how, famously World of Warcraft has balanced their game, is since they knew there were so many different variables. And yes, a MMO probably has way more variables than it does have way more variables than League of Legends itself, right? So in order to maintain some of that and keep some sanity in there, they have to do classes, or else there's going to be a whole bunch of broken shit and they'll never be able to bug hunt at that point. But we're getting to the point to where League of Legends may be headed in that direction. Now, I'm not saying that I want item classes to happen. I think as you go as long as you can without doing item classes until the game is almost unplayable because too many champions are abusing too many different things. And I think we're slowly starting to get there. Now, Riot had already did this, actually, in fact. If you go not even that far back, really, I want to say this was like season 6, maybe, to where they did this for junglers, right? Famously, Blue Ezreal, he was played in the mid lane, and he would go AP, and he would use this item called Rune Glaive, which gave a ton of AP, like, damage. It was essentially Luden's Echo, but cheaper, and you also had a smite, and the smite would do damage to someone. So it was actually insane. And old Ezreal, I know you guys probably have played the game since old Ezreal, where his W used to scale with AP, so he was just a burst machine, and it really sucked. His lane phase was really good too, and it was just an overall nightmare to play against this guy. Then you go a little bit further, and Riot started to release items that had melee stats and range stats, right? So usually it would nerf the stats for a ranged user, so it really wouldn't be worth it for a ranged user to even pick that up. And sometimes they would do complete lockouts of, a ranged user getting, any type of particular stat, so you couldn't even really use it, right? I think Steric's Gauge is that way currently. So they're clearly already on this trend because they see certain items that are very problematic, and maybe they want to introduce certain mechanics that simply cannot function unless you put some type of class. And they've done probably the broadest and simplest classes that they can do, which is, junglers and range versus melee, right? Those are very, very simple, but I think we're going to start to get more complex. And I think to further that point, Riot have fundamentally ran into a problem with balancing, which is base stats, and the fact that you have to have certain champion archetypes that have higher base stats than others because you develop a champion maybe so that they scale better than other champions, but that means that their base stats have to be lower, right? Just that's inherent fundamental of what it is to be, an early game champion versus a late game champion. There has to be some type of that trade-off. But with that comes usually base stats getting out of control at certain points, and especially in combination with certain items. And it's oftentimes that those champions that have a high base stat, such, we're talking about fucking tanks, right? And how tanks can suddenly deal insane amounts of damage, or juggernauts can do insane amount of damage and seemingly have no trade-off, right? You can be tanky and you can do damage, and it doesn't make any sense at that point, right? And then you have assassins, who can then become tanky yet still do a ton of damage. So you have this cross mesh of champions, and these cross, I guess subclasses is what Riot is calling them. And so I think this becomes a really big problem that can get very out of hand necessarily, So, and then you have the idea of what Riot has been trying to avoid this entire time. In fact, I think basically all throughout League of Legends history, Riot has tried to avoid this problem, and it kind of got lit up in their eyes when they saw Rune Glaive Ezreal and Master Yi AP, when basically Master Yi would do 1 billion damage with his Q because his Q had crazy like AP scaling. And then on top of that, before in old Akali, she used to have great scaling for both AP and AD, and then you would buy this item called Hextech Gunblade, which had both of those stats, and so it was just really ridiculous, and she was very good. But Riot are really wary of mixing AP and AD in the same item, because then that makes it to where it's more viable for a champion to go one way or the other, and then it's also hard for tanks to itemize against that type of damage. And so this is one entire playstyle that Riot really doesn't want you to go down. And you could see that every time that a champion ends up having a different build that is not traditional for what damage type that they were originally meant to have. One big instance is obviously Shyvana, right? Everyone know, I think she's on the list for reworks, right? And everyone is just like, it's fucking toxic to play against Diana, right? It's either she doesn't do anything and she just falls behind, or she's super far ahead and you can't get anywhere near her when she's in her dragon form because she'll just fucking one-shot you with her E, right? So it is kind of like a toxic like champion to play against when she is ahead. But I think overall, Riot are tasked with an impossible task. And I think for the most part, Riot has done a pretty good job balancing, although I don't like how they force metas. But I think generally what their ideology is they are opposed to ways which make the game play very different. And that means ways in which a player can make the entire system of how the game is played. And that's not accepted by Riot. So, for instance, that would be the whole lane swap meta. That's a system type level of change, right? And the fact that people figured out if they played this certain way, if they, did this certain strategy or had these certain items, that was a system change, right? And that was brought on by the player. Well, it's brought on by the pro player base. The funnel meta, that was a system change, right? It changed the fundamental ways in how you play all the roles. And I think the fucked up thing about how Riot are balancing their game, and this goes into what is currently happening, which is the top lane meta, to where now we're seeing supports in the top lane, right? So we're seeing Janna with Smite or Karma with Smite, right? And people might say that is a toxic way of playing the game, right? Like it's bad fundamentally for the systems, right? But originally, when the game first came out, ADCs were not in the bot lane. We had to establish that meta ourselves as players, right? And that was largely due to Fnatic way back in Season 1. But it's how we end up trying to shape the game, and Riot are a little bit too heavy-handed when it comes to trying to shape the game as far as the meta is concerned. And we could see this with the lane swap meta, or with the Korean style of warding, or like any large system type of play that players have come up with, which Riot have fundamentally attacked with patches specifically to target those specific strategies. And sometimes I think you need to let players figure out countermeasures, kind of like the old days of, Brood War, for instance, where I don't want to go that far to where, there are like no changes for years and then they come out with like a small change. I don't want that to happen. But CSGO, for instance, I think has a healthy amount of change, maybe a little bit more slow, more on the slow side, right? And maybe all the boomers like that so that they can, keep consistent with the game or whatever and master the game. I think that's cool. And if you want to appease, the people with ADHD, then yeah, fine, you can go a little bit faster. But I think Riot has kind of put themselves in a hole because they want to change the game at such a fast pace to where no one can master the game. But at the same time, that leads into development issues, right? Into balancing problems. And so they've put themselves into a corner. Like, this is their own doing. This is their own work. And the only way that I see for them to be able to continue, and I think the ball is already rolling downhill, and I don't think you can stop it at this point, it's the idea that they would have to introduce item classes. I don't see any other way for them to be able to fix their game as far as like a balancing fundamental. And also too, you have to think, as they add more items, or as they add different objectives on the map, or as they add more champions in the game, the rate, or the exponential rate of differences when it comes to the games or the different game states is crazy. And then on top of that, you have to think, well, that means that you have to expand your balance team, or else they aren't going to be able to keep up with as many ideas that they can come up with as far as that. And then on top of that, with how they're developing champions, that means that you have to think of more and more crazy mechanics and more crazy ideas to freshen up the space, which then means that you're going to create more game-breaking things, right? And so you've kind of put yourself in a gaming development like box, and I don't see any other way for them to get out of it other than just to do item classes. And I think that sucks for the freedom of, player expression and player ingenuity, but I don't see any other way that they'll be able to continue to balance this game.